region. Having covered that housekeeping, I'll introduce Steve. Steve's relatively new to the University of Portsmouth, having only joined last year, although I think his relationship with the Solent goes back much further. At Portsmouth, he's Director of Sustainability and Environment, with an aim to build on existing successes in ocean research by encouraging interdisciplinary cross-university working. I think he's also keen to strengthen the emerging potential areas of excellence, which include things like sustainable food, sustainable fashion. And although this might sound like enough, Steve's also a professor of ocean policy and economy, being one of the top 10 most cited scientists in the field of marine policy. And he has an expertise in ocean conservation that's been developed during about 20 years of research and practice. He's a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel and a fellow of the United Nations Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre based in Cambridge. As an advocate for global ocean conservation and a sustainable future, he's completely committed to furthering research and activities inside and outside of the university that generate positive impact for people and the planet. He currently leads the university's Revolution Plastics Initiative, driving interdisciplinary research and innovation to solve challenges in areas as diverse as recycling, packaging and wastewater treatment. He's also chair of the Portsmouth Climate Board. So with all this on the go, it's absolutely fantastic that he's found time to come and talk with us today. And I was delighted when he agreed to come and speak as part of this Future South webinar series. So without any further delay, I am really pleased to introduce Professor Steve Fletcher. Steve,
Thank you, David. Thank you for that very kind introduction indeed. So, first of all, thank you for the invitation, David and Future South colleagues. It's lovely to be here talking to you. It's a shame we can't be doing it face to face, but I guess we all understand why that is. So I'd like to introduce the university's Revolution Plastics Initiative to you. I'd like to do that by talking about the global context in which we're operating. I'd like to say a few words about the University of Portsmouth sustainability plans, which are evolving and quite ambitious. I'd like to talk very much about what the Revolution Plastics Initiative is and finish off by thinking about how you can get involved and what you can do to partner with us in our initiative. Now, plastic has been in the headlines for the last few years, really, and that's often been attributed to the Blue Planet 2 effect. I think in reality, and for those of us that have been working in this field behind the scenes for quite some time, it doesn't feel like a new topic. It feels like a challenge that has existed for a very long time. Before I joined the University of Portsmouth, I worked for the United Nations Environment Programme. In that context, we were doing a lot of work with countries, with presidents and prime ministers, to showcase to them the nature of the challenge around plastics and how their policy choices could make a difference. But ultimately, it comes down to emotions and tugging at heartstrings, as well as the scientific reality of it. And images like the one you see on the screen now do as much sometimes as a whole load of scientific papers and meetings to advocate policy change. So we know that plastics can make a significant difference and have a negative impact on the environment and on species, particularly big species like this. But what perhaps is less well known is that plastics can also have a significant impact on humans and human health, although implicitly it kind of makes sense. Yet there isn't a huge amount of research into how plastics really do impact people. We know from some studies that exist already that having a life closely intertwined with plastic, like these children do here, results in plastics being ingested or taken into the body, either through food or through recreational activities like this. We also know that people who work closely with plastics in their job, perhaps someone who fits carpet, for instance, is continuously breathing in fibers from the carpet, and often there's an accumulation of plastic in people's lungs who work with plastic very closely. Of course, wearing the appropriate safety equipment does offset that risk, of course, and I hope that people do, but that isn't the case universally, and it isn't the case globally. And what we've found, or what the research community has found, that up to 1 million people per year in developing countries die from mismanaged plastic waste. And that's largely through the burning of plastic waste and the inhalation of the toxic fumes, or it's through the ingestion of plastic through the food chain. And this has led David Attenborough and others to announce that plastic pollution is an unfolding catastrophe. What you can see there in the back of that picture is a waste site in Indonesia. This is where plastic is largely exported from countries like ours to less developed countries with often less capacity to deal with that waste effectively. It's essentially an economic transaction to deal with the waste. But it ends up in places like this, and you can see that people there have no protective equipment, and most of that waste will end up being incinerated in all likelihood. So it's quite a challenging situation. We also have to reflect on the situation that single-use plastics in particular have a very, very short lifespan in use, as short as 12 minutes. So on average, the lifespan of a single-use piece of plastic is around 12 minutes. It obviously takes a lot of energy to produce that item, a lot of fossil fuels. It's used for 12 minutes, and then it ends up in a site like this on the screen, and either leaks into nature or is burned. And if it leaks into nature, well, we call that pollution, of course, and that would take in the vicinity of 200 to 300 years to degrade. So it's a lot of legacy for something that's a momentary use of plastic. The source of plastics entering the ocean is quite interesting. There's a very clear geography to all of this. The size of the circle in this image indicates the amount of plastic waste that's generated by the relevant country. Where there are no dots, there's no data. And the color of the circle represents the percentage of that waste that's properly managed. Sorry, that's inadequately managed. So the darker the color, the worse the management of that waste. And you can see that in North America and in Europe and most of South America, the way in which plastic waste is managed is okay, but there's a lot of it. It's still not, there is still obviously a lot of mismanagement of that plastic waste. And that creates pollution, it creates flows into nature. But actually, it's when we look at parts of Africa, but primarily Southeast Asia, that the main flows of plastic into the environment exist. And globally speaking, there's a lot of effort to work with those countries to really identify the main leakage points. And often it's around poor levels of waste collection, and then poor levels of or inappropriate, I should say, waste treatment. So these are solutions. We know the solutions. We just need to implement them around the world. And certainly from the perspective of young people and from the perspective of connections to climate, then the plastics debate and the climate debate are related, of course. Plastics are an increasing user of fossil fuels by percentage. And if we're serious about tackling climate change, we need to also think about the role of plastic in that context. That's been quite doom and gloom, I appreciate, and I'm not really usually a doom and gloom monger, but the scale of the problem is tremendous, and it's easy to dismiss that and to ignore it. One might also argue that the problem is exacerbated a little bit at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we are all required to wear face coverings. Many people choose to use disposable face coverings, which consist of essentially single-use plastics. And certainly as I'm walking around the streets of Portsmouth at the moment, you see them in the street all the time. So the leakage into nature is pretty serious, and the pandemic is playing its role in that, unfortunately. However, I would also say that things like the climate protests are reminders, I think, that we can do things differently, and we shouldn't always see plastic as a negative. We need it as part of our economy. We need it to function within society. It's critically important that it's in PPE, that we can use it in order to go about our lives more safely. So we're not, or I'm not certainly inherently against plastic. What we're against, and what Revolution Plastic is trying to address, are the negative elements of plastic in its production, in its use, and in its disposal. Next, I'd like to share with you some interesting, or I hope interesting, figures from a report that was released only a few weeks ago called Breaking the Plastic Wave. And this is probably, I would say, the world's most up-to-date on the numbers around plastic pollution. And I'm sorry, but the report paints, again, quite a grim picture. The headlines for the report suggest that plastic waste will increase between now, or between 2016 and 2040, or is increasing. It's almost doubling, in fact, in terms of its production. The leakage or pollution of that plastic waste into the ocean will increase from around 11 million tons per year at the moment to around 29 million tons a year at the moment. That's a threefold increase almost. And that means some pretty challenging things for the stock of plastic in the ocean. And this study anticipates that between now and 2040, the stock of plastic in the ocean will quadruple to around 450-ish million tons. But I imagine you're thinking, as we all know about the plastic problem, and we know that the challenge is getting worse, not better, and we know that David Attenborough's told us it's bad, there must be a whole set of policy ambitions that are driving action to change that. Well, yes and no, I think, is probably the answer to that question. This chart here shows the results of an analysis of the policies that have been put in place at the national scale, so within countries, to tackle plastics pollution. And these are the policies that have been put in place year on year. And it's organised by the income level of the countries concerned. So the blue, dark blue are countries like ours, countries like the UK, European countries, North America, and so on, Australia. Then we have the upper middle, lower middle, and low income countries. And I think the striking thing about this image, first of all, if you look at the number of policy responses since the year 2000, they are increasing a bit, but really we're only, the chart only goes up to 20. So even in 2017, we had 20 new plastic policies at the national scale, but that decreased in 2018, and we don't have the figures for the last couple of years. But what you can see there as well, it's the countries that are below the high income countries, in income level at least, that seem to be taking most action. The developed countries, the global north, although obviously there is some increase in recent years, are not really where the action is happening when it comes to policies to tackle plastic pollution. I would also say that the study that's cited here really unambiguously identifies plastic policy responses as fragmented and isolated. So it could be an individual country banning carrier bags, or putting a tax on carrier bags, or banning microplastics in beauty products. These are not going to prevent plastic entering the ocean. to prevent plastic entering the ocean, we need to do things like have better collection of waste, have solid waste management systems that don't create leakage into nature. We need to have less plastic products available in the first place. So there's a really strong push right now to recognise that the policy response, globally speaking, is pretty inadequate compared to the scale of the problem. In fact, the estimate that was published a couple of weeks ago is that the current policies in place will only reduce plastic entering the ocean by 7% by 2040, 7%, which at least to my mind seems an inadequate level of response from the policy community. However, there are things we can do. The study I mentioned that was published a couple of weeks ago, Breaking the Plastic Wave, looked at what we can do to reduce plastics entering the ocean and plastics into nature in general, based on existing knowledge. We all have a sense, I think, of the sorts of things we can do to reduce plastic waste. And this chart, in admittedly quite a complicated way, tries to show us what we can do to reduce plastic entering the ocean. So I'll just try to explain it as best I can. So the diagonal line going from just above 200 diagonally rightwards, upwards, with business as usual written next to it, that shows the level of plastic entering the ocean, the plastic waste produced every year under a business as usual scenario. And you can see it's growing year on year. And the different coloured chunks within that chart look at how we can reduce that level of plastic waste by putting certain actions in place. So the blue shaded interventions there are to simply reduce plastic in the economy by taking plastics out of products. The lighter blue is reducing plastic waste by substituting in other materials, so replacing plastic with other things. And there they talk about paper and compostables. We can improve recycling to take plastic out of the waste stream. And there is some work going on in Portsmouth and other places that we'll talk about in a moment that helps with that recycling. And we can look at better disposal options. And what this chart shows us that we might only really end up with the red colours at the bottom of the chart, and that's the plastic that just continues to be mismanaged, that's really difficult to prevent leaking to the ocean. So if you add all of those numbers together by reducing, substituting, better recycling, better disposal, we can get to around sort of 80 to 90% reduction in plastics entering nature, just using stuff we know about already. So maybe the challenge then is action, and political action, and action from all of us to really begin to make a difference, rather than a lack of understanding of what the problem is. I think that's probably where we're at. And that brings us to Revolution Plastics. And it brings us to what the University of Portsmouth is doing around sustainability, climate and plastics. The University of Portsmouth has issued its next 10-year strategy in January this year. And a core part of that strategy is to become climate positive by 2030. So the vast majority of organisations and universities have committed to become climate neutral or carbon neutral, but we've decided to go beyond that. We've decided that being carbon neutral is good and a fine ambition, and we're happy with that. But if we want to lead by example, if we want to be responsible to our students and think about future generations in a way that is probably, universities have more of an onus on them to think in that way, then we really need to go beyond simply carbon neutral to be climate positive. So that's going 10% beyond carbon neutral. So merely as a function of the university's existence and our working patterns, we will reduce the amount of carbon contributing to climate change by 2030. More broadly, what we're trying to do also, or what we're committed to do, I should say, is to take a lead in environmental sustainability and climate action. So what we want to do is treat or develop our university's ambitions around sustainability through our research. So actively focusing our research on how we transform the university and support the city. Think about how we can promote sustainability through civic leadership. So really playing a role within the city to drive the city's sustainability transition direction. We want to partner with our students and our staff on sustainability, so leading within our own immediate community, on our own population, and ultimately get our own house in order and deliver sustainability across all of our operations. And ultimately, I suppose what we're trying to do is work with our partners. And we'd welcome any of you watching this seminar now who would be interested in working with us to work towards transforming Portsmouth. I say Portsmouth because we're based in Portsmouth, but actually the Solent and beyond is our area that we really want to make a difference within. And one of the main vehicles we're using to make a difference is Revolution Plastics. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about that and give some examples of what we're working on already in that context. So Revolution Plastics is a whole university initiative. We're pulling together expertise from right across the range of the university's actions around a values-based commitment. So we're committed to supporting a revolution in which damaging environmental and health impacts arising from unsustainable plastic production, use and disposal are eliminated. That's quite a grand ambition, and we can't do it alone, of course. I'll give an indication in a few minutes the sorts of partners we're working with to help us move towards achieving this ambition. But there's commitment to this from top to bottom within the university. There's been some significant financial investment in supporting this, and also investment in a political sense to build partnerships and to develop technologies and buying equipment that helps us move in this particular direction. How do we want to do this? Well, we are already actually beginning to establish ourselves in the plastics sector as a trusted knowledge broker, connecting researchers, policymakers, businesses, and citizens. In a few minutes, I'll talk about some work we're doing for the G20, some work we're doing in the Global South, and also some work that was released only yesterday, or the day before, actually on the 28th, focused on our work around enzymes. So within Revolution Plastics, we have three main ambitions. The first one, and this, as you will appreciate, ties in with the university strategy, is to transform the University of Portsmouth into one of the world's greenest universities. And I have to say we're a long way from that right now, but we're committed to being transparent and open in our transformation and in our transition, and to share the ups and downs of that journey. We genuinely intend to place the environment and sustainability ambitions at the heart of what we do, and that we think will have implications for what it means to be a university, and certainly what it means to be the University of Portsmouth going forward. We want to create a world-leading plastics academic community, and David's alluded to this a little bit already in his introduction, but we have academic colleagues who are working on plastics-related issues across the entire university. We have people working in fashion and food, as David mentioned. We also have people working in our engineering department who are looking at alternative materials to strip plastics out of the supply chain. We have people working on our business and law faculty who are working directly with businesses to help them circularize their economy and to become less reliant on single and other forms of plastic. We have our enzyme technology, our Centre for Enzyme Innovation, which is looking at how we can digest plastics as part of a recycling process more effectively. We have colleagues working in the Global South who are looking at how cities, and pretty major cities like Nairobi, can transform their fortunes through treating the plastic waste that they have to deal with. And we have people working in the marine part of the university, the Marine Sciences Institute, who are looking at the effects of plastic uptake by marine animals and looking at how we can begin to address some of those challenges in a marine context, including through wastewater treatment and anti-pollution measures, and interestingly, the restoration of marine and coastal habitats. So one major one major approach to improving water quality in the Solent and the health of the Solent would be to restore the habitats of the Solent. 200 years ago, the Solent was an amazingly rich kelp-dominated, salt marsh-dominated habitat. Now it's not, and that has some tremendously negative implications for the quality of the ecosystem, but also the effect of pollutants in the Solent too. And finally, within Revolution Plastics, we want to see ourselves as a global showcase for a sustainable plastics future. We're committed to helping see Portsmouth as a test bed for plastics policies. We're working very hard behind the scenes with industry and industry bodies, plastic industry bodies, to really establish Portsmouth on the map as a place that companies and campaign groups might want to come to, or governments might want to look at, in order to test out policies that can reduce plastics. We also want to showcase what's possible in Portsmouth by working with Portsmouth City Council and other partners to really drive change within the city. But I think what would be quite useful, just to finish off my presentation, is just to talk a little bit about what we're doing already. So I think there are a few things I'd like to raise. First is that we're working with the community already within Portsmouth. And that's critically important, as we need those foundations. So we're working with a tech company called Jetsam, which I'll come back to in a moment. But what Jetsam do is allow individuals to take photographs of plastic waste they find on the streets or on the beach or wherever, upload that to a live map, and the map of Portsmouth that you can see on the left side shows the distribution of plastic within the city. I screenshot that last week. So one day last week, that was the concentration of plastic waste in and around Portsmouth. We work with the hospital, the Navy, the City Council, the Climate Action Board, and various charities and other groups as well, who are committed to the same ambitions as us. I will just flag up Jetsam just for a moment. The university has recently signed a formal partnership with Jetsam. They are totally committed to the same ambitions as I've described here so far as the university, but really engaging with people, the citizens within the city. We're looking to work with Jetsam to expand out their range across the Solent and much further afield besides. So please do watch that space, and if you can, download the Jetsam app and start recording plastic waste wherever you are. We're also working with the university, with the city council, and there's a supportive quote there from Councillor Ashmore, who's the portfolio holder for climate and environment within the city council. Just before we finish, I'd like to talk just a little bit about some of our international work, because this is also very important. I don't want to inadvertently suggest that we're just interested in working in Portsmouth and the Solent. We're entirely committed to global action as well, and here are some of the partners that we're already working with. But what are we doing with them? There are a few things I just want to bring to your attention. The first one is something that's just been completed, actually. We were the science partner of a rowing race around the outside edge of the UK. As the boats were going around the UK, they collected data on sound and microplastics. We're just going through the analysis of that now, but what we were seeking to do is figure out how marine species are affected by microplastics in UK waters. And the reason for collecting the sound data is for certain species that emit sound, you can begin to correlate the presence of those species with the concentrations of microplastics in the water. So that will be published within the next few months. We're working hard in two places, in Nairobi in Kenya and Sylhet in Bangladesh, and we're working there with some of the poorest communities, as you can see from the slide there, to help bring up and build up their living standards through tackling the chronic plastic pollution that they're having to deal with. And these are some of the more obviously challenging, in all sorts of ways, actually, impacts of plastic pollution. And we're using here sort of methods that perhaps you wouldn't normally associate with plastics research. We're using song, theatre, graffiti, performance art to engage people who are not normally engaged in these sorts of topics. And just before lockdown, I was in Nairobi, and these techniques work in some of these communities in a way that we would only dream of having the traction in this country. So it's a really interesting approach that we're taking. The final thing I'd like to talk about just very briefly is something you might have heard of, is our plastic eating enzyme work, which is being driven out of our Centre for Enzyme Innovation. This work has been progressing for the last 4 or 5 years within the university, with a major breakthrough around 18 to 20 months ago, where we were able to engineer an enzyme to digest plastic, particularly plastics within plastic bottles, much more quickly. Since then, we've received significant investment from within the university, but also from the UK government as well, and most recently from the LEP. And I'm very excited to share with you, and you may have seen this on various news outlets over the last couple of days, but we have been able to increase the speed at which our engineered enzyme digests plastic by sixfold. And this acceleration of the digestion rate happens at room temperature. So that's the key thing. So enzymes can digest plastic more quickly at high temperatures, but getting it to happen at room temperature is critically important, because if we were serious about scaling up this technology, then it has to work in low energy environments as well as in high energy hot industrial environments. So this is well, we think a major breakthrough, and it's been the result of a lot of hard work, and we're really keen to continue on this work and build partnerships to really drive change. We're also doing quite a lot of work with the G20, but unfortunately I don't feel we really have time to tackle that now or to describe that now. But suffice to say, our researchers are currently deeply involved in the UN system to really figure out what policy options might make a difference at the global scale to eliminate plastic entering the ocean. We're working closely with the government of Japan, who were the G20 president last year, and we're just building relationships with the Saudi Arabian government, who are the president of the G20 this year. That's a very exciting project, and we think it's heading towards perhaps a global agreement on plastics being reached sometime next year. But that's very much subject to the political storms along the way. Finally, what can you do? Well, there's lots of things that we can do in our everyday lives, and I suppose I'm talking to you today more as an individual as well as a business leader. It is possible, of course, to make individual commitments and institutional commitments to use less plastic, to reduce the amounts of plastic you buy or you use in the supply chain. And some companies are already just simply looking at their products and think, well, is there unnecessary plastic in our products? So I was talking to a business leader last week, and he was telling me that all of his products are packed in boxes with a little plastic carry handle. And he suddenly realized that you don't actually need that little plastic carry handle. So it stripped something like 50 tons of plastic out of the supply chain just by that one change. So these changes are quite easy to make. If you are interested in learning more, if you're interested in looking at where there might be opportunities for collaboration, please do get in touch. We're also looking for examples of good practice that we can share. Excuse me. So please feel free to share your stories with us as well. we're quite a nice, friendly bunch, and we're pretty tame as academics go. So please do feel free to get in touch and share your story. What we think is that if we can change things in Portsmouth and change things in the Solent, we can change them everywhere. So please do feel free to join the revolution and work with us in our shared mission. So thank you for your attention. Thank you, David. I will stop there and I will cease sharing my screen, and hopefully you'll pop back up in front of us. Here we go.
Thank you, Steve. There might have been a minor error. I just need to check the nothing major, but the contact us said Revolution Plastics and then the letter I. I'm assuming the letter I shouldn't have been there.
Oh yes, you're right. The letter I should not be there. So Revolution Plastics at Portsmouth. Sorry, Revolution Plastics at port.ac.uk. Thank you, David. Well spotted.
That's all right. Because I don't want people to reach out and then get the wrong address. So Revolution Plastics at port.ac.uk. Right, brilliant. There's some questions flooding in, so do please ask them. It helps me with my job. There was one that was asked almost at the very beginning, and as you've almost finished with the enzyme stuff, I will ask it, but then we'll move on. But somebody's asked about the time scale, or what the thinking is around getting to something that is industrially viable or at scale, that sort of thing. I mean, obviously the news yesterday showed that the scientists at Portsmouth have already got it to 6 times faster or whatever than the last lot. But do you know anything around? I know this is hard, but you know, those aspirations or the activity that's going on to scale up the discoveries that have been made at Portsmouth.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's a great question, and I think the scientists working on the enzymes themselves would like to know the answer to that question. Yeah. I think the ambition, well, I know the ambition is to do exactly that, is to scale up the way in which the enzyme can be applied to industrial processes. In terms of the timescale, then it depends on so many different things. It depends on the scientific breakthroughs, of which the room temperature one is actually a key scientific breakthrough, as I understand it, but also then just to simply make something that works in a laboratory conditions work in a waste recovery site anywhere in the world, that's quite a major change. So I know our colleagues in the Centre for Enzyme Innovation are working with a variety of businesses who can help with that scaling up. I know the questions about timescale, I simply don't know, and I think that's something the team is just desperate to figure out themselves. Well, how do you get from a good scientific breakthrough that has huge promise into something that is part of our everyday lives? That's quite a challenging transition.
Thank you. And I know that the university's invested in people to help with that and to help liaise with industry and stuff like that. So I guess obviously they're taking it seriously to try and find that that link. So fortunately, the majority of your talk and the end of your talk gave us a lot of hope. So thank you for that. But when you began, not intentionally, just because you were telling us the picture as it is, it all felt quite big and difficult and just quite overwhelming, I guess, in that whole sense of the plastics. And I guess you could say the same about climate change. How do you stop yourself even from going? Because a lot of people, when they might not realize the scale of the problem, or they try and ignore it, and then when they do realize that it's that kind of enormous, people can kind of go from denial to despair really quickly without, it's the, oh, I can't do anything about that sort of mentality, I guess, which we all feel, I think. What are your thoughts around that? How do you encourage people? I think somebody, is just telling these good news stories as they come out, but how do you encourage people to move, or not to go straight to despair and think, what can one person do, that sort of thing, or how can I contribute? I don't know if you can say anything around all that stuff.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's for just on a personal note, because you asked about me personally, and then I'll answer your question more broadly. I generally in life feel glass half full, so I see opportunities rather than challenges, and I see tackling the global plastic problem as something that requires an understanding of the actual scale of the problem in order to then take an optimistic view of how we deal with it. So, for example, one thing that really struck me recently when the Breaking the Plastic Wave report came out, which I mentioned a few times in the presentation, was that the current policies that are in place will only reduce plastics by entering the ocean by 7%, and that was a major surprise to me, because there is a sense that governments are taking action. There's a sense that I think people in most countries know that plastic is a problem. And when you combine those two things, you kind of think, well, gosh, there must be loads of stuff going on that really is making a difference in tackling that. So at the personal level, when the numbers indicated very clearly that's not happening, the government response is just not proportionate to the scale of the problem. I personally found that quite shocking and quite depressing, because even for someone who works in this field all the time, that 7% number was a total shock, actually, and a total surprise, and a massive disappointment, actually. But what I can say is that through the work we've been doing for the G20, what I've found is that there are certain countries that are really committed to reversing that situation. And Japan, for whatever reason, is totally committed to that. Other members of the G20 are as well, Germany in particular. The European Union is a member of the G20, and they're pushing for what they call systemic change. So they're not pushing for individual bans on bags or, I don't know, beauty products. They're saying, actually, we just need to change the system within which plastics operate. So transitioning to a circular economy, minimizing plastics in products in the first place, replacing plastics with other products that are less damaging. All of the things that kind of make sense and seem reasonable are part of a growing policy agenda around excuse me, around tackling plastics. So on the one hand, the numbers are depressing and bad, but on the other hand, it's almost the negativity around those numbers is prompting action in a way that I certainly haven't seen before. And I'll just say one more thing, Dave, and then I'll stop talking. There is a real push for a global agreement on plastics that will really transform things like the trade in plastics. It will transform what plastics are, I guess, allowed to be in certain products. It might transform, the plastics economy in a way that promotes recycling and promotes design standards, perhaps, in products, that sort of thing. And it looks like February next year is going to be a crucial moment in that. Every 2 years or so, there's something called the UN Environment Assembly, which is essentially a bit like the UN General Assembly, a bit like Security Council, but for the environment. This body meets and essentially sets new policy goals that countries then get behind. So there's going to be a huge push at that meeting in February next year for a global agreement on plastics. I should say it's not universally supported. There are some countries who are not keen at all on that, but there are, a majority of countries who are keen to support that and move it forward. So there is hope. What can individuals do? Just look at the parts of your life you have control over, and make different choices. It's as simple as that, really. It's not any more complicated than that. It's as simple as that. And one of the nice things about taking action personally is you can see plastic. You use plastic in your everyday life. It's not some mysterious thing about like carbon emissions. How much carbon have I emitted today? Not entirely sure, but I don't know. But actually, how how much plastic you've used, because it's visible. It's part of your life in a way that other environmental impacts are not. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Steve. There is a question. So that comment about that potential that exists for next year, would that have an effect? There's a question from Ben Earl on the chat about, despite some widespread public opinion, there are companies that are still very much investing in the new development of plastics. Would that sort of level of United Nations agreement, if it goes ahead, curb some of that activity potentially?
I don't know. It's very hard to say what would be in that agreement, but I think it's important to say that plastics inherently are not bad. So it may well be appropriate investment in plastics that's going on, not inappropriate. And actually, I mean, this is where the systemic nature of the challenge comes in. So if we put in let's think, let's say if we're designing a new product, and in that product, some global agreement states that there can only be one of, I don't know, 10 different types of plastic to keep recycling simple, and it has to be minimized as much as possible. So for that legal agreement to work, just kind of think about what that needs. It needs the customer to choose that product in the first place. It means the customer to then dispose, or the user to dispose of that product into the waste system that is effectively managed. That waste system then needs to take that product to an appropriately equipped recycling or disposal center. Let's say it's recycling. And that recycling process then has to break down those plastics in such a way that they can be then reused back at the beginning of the life cycle of a product. So actually having a legal agreement in place is all well and good, but actually what you then also need are sort of behavior responses, you need a recycling system, you need solid waste management, you need a system that circularizes it back. And so that's why it has to be a system change, because any change in any one of those bits is almost meaningless, actually. But the one thing we can do that reduces plastic pollution is just use less. If there's less, if 10% leaks out of the system every day, if we just need to make the system smaller, and then the 10% leakage gets smaller every day. So simply using less is the best thing you can do at this moment in time.
So, I mean, obviously one obvious thing to use less is, as you say, just don't use stuff. But from the somebody asked about the Pews slide as well, and the indication that reuse. If we then start to, so I suppose repurpose, reuse, get the circular economy thing going, but that will have a massive impact. But it's difficult. But you've introduced some, but are there any other really exciting examples, either through Revolution Plastics or elsewhere, that you've seen that really give you hope for the future?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think what I would, I mean, that's quite a tricky question. I mean, what we see are individual institutions or individual countries who are committed to making change, but they don't have control over everything that needs to change in order to deliver the system change that is required. So what's really needed is some form of essentially certainly national leadership, but also global leadership, I suppose. And something that was published earlier this week was something called the Leaders Pledge for Nature. I don't know if anybody saw this, but at the moment in New York, although actually, I think finishing today, is a conference on biodiversity, a UN conference on biodiversity, and it's meant to be a precursor for the Convention on Biological Diversity conference next year in China. And the Leaders' Declaration, or the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, reasserts the ambition to prevent plastic entering the ocean. It commits to preventing any new plastic entering the ocean by 2050. Now, it's a long way off, but it's a long way off because it's that scale of system change that's needed. So also in the Pew report, just out of interest, it states that 500,000 people every day need to be connected to a waste collection system in order but by every day until 2040 for the systemic change to really be effective. I'll just say that again. Sorry, I slightly confused myself there. 500,000 people need to be added to the waste collection system every day between now and 2040 in order to generate a global systemic change. And so I'm not really doing very well on the positivity front here, David. Do apologise, but it's it's if we're looking at this as a global challenge, then there are huge barriers that need to be leapt over. But what I keep seeing, and it is easy to be sceptical about this, but what I keep seeing is political commitment to drive towards it. And it's reports like the Pew report, the work that we're doing with the G20, and things like Revolution Plastics that's kind of just bringing these debates to the surface all the time, which is actively pushing that political change and pushing the political ambition, I suppose, would be the way of saying it.
Brilliant. I put there's a link that's gone up to the Leaders Pledge for Nature in the chat box for those that are watching. We're about out of time, so I think there's a huge amount of there that's exciting that you've given us to think about, that we can get on board with. So that's fantastic. Thank you, Steve. There's some money available for both innovation support and some efficiency grants as well, and you can find out all about those on Green Tech South website. So just look at the Green Tech South website and you can find out more information there. But otherwise, I hope that's been useful. There will at some point be a recording available, and so if you think you know people that would have benefited from this or found this interesting, then please do tell them all about it. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us.